Welcome back to Naked History Debrief, the companion show where we sweep up the historical crumbs, pry open the footnotes, and ask the very important question: what weird, fascinating, inconveniently complicated details do we leave on the cutting room floor? I'm Dylan Gasaway, and this week we're still circling the story of Amelia Earhart, aviation icon, record breaker, media phenomenon, practical pants enthusiast, and probably one of the only people in history who could make a leather flight jacket look like it's both a feminist manifesto and a weather advisory. In the main episode, we talked about Earhart's rise, her fame, her final flight, and the mystery that turned her disappearance into one of the most durable historical rabbit holes of the 20th century. But today, we're pulling the camera back a little, because Amelia Earhart did not vanish alone. And if we're going to talk about her last flight, we need to talk about the man beside her navigator, Fred Noonan. And if Amelia was the headline, Noonan was the guy trying to make sure the headline didn't read, well, Pacific Ocean claimed another. So first up is Naked Regrets, and we need to clear something up because Fred Noonan was not just some guy Amelia picked at the aviation equivalent of the Bass Pro Shop parking lot. He was an experienced navigator with a serious resume. Before aviation, Noonan had spent years at sea. He had worked in the merchant marine, served during World War I, and became deeply familiar with the old school art of navigation, the kind that required math, instruments, celestial readings, and quiet confidence of a person who can look at the sky and say, ah, yes, here we are, while the rest of us are just wondering if that cloud looks like a duck or a fish. By the 1930s, he had moved into aviation and worked with the Pan American Airways, helping chart routes across the Pacific. And that matters because commercial aviation over the Pacific was still very new and very high stakes. There were no glowing blue GPS lines, no little airplane icon moving across a phone screen, and no recalculating voice politely judging your life choices. Noonan's job was to take a tiny aircraft over an absurd amount of ocean and find tiny landing points scattered across the map like someone had spilled pepper in the Pacific. And by the time Amelia Earhart chose him for her final world flight attempt, Noonan had the exact kind of experience that she had needed. He had been a merchant seaman, he had been an aviation navigator, and he had helped Pan Am figure out how to cross enormous stretches of ocean by air. In other words, if you were trying to thread an airplane through the Pacific and land on a tiny island that looked like a typo on a map, Fred Noonan was the kind of person you wanted in the other seat. And that is important, the other seat, because Noonan was not really Earhart's co pilot in the way some people often think. He was her navigator. Earhart was flying the plane, and Noonan was helping figure out where the plane was in relation to the very large and very wet and very unforgiving planet beneath them. On Earhart's first world flight attempt in March of 1937, the crew was different. The original plan included Noonan and another experienced navigator and radio operator, Harry Manning. Manning had been expected to help out with part of the journey, especially across complicated oceanic routes. But that first attempt ended before it could really begin. Earhart's Lockheed Electra was badly damaged during a crash and a takeoff in Hawaii, and the plane had to be repaired, the route had to be reworked, and the schedule changed, and the whole attempt was reset. So when Earhart finally began again, this time flying west to east, Fred Noonan was the person beside her. And it's important to highlight Noonan as well, because Earhart's mystery often gets framed as a solo tragedy. Amelia against the sky, Amelia against the ocean, Amelia against history's most aggressive game of hide and seek. But Noonan was there too. He had a life, he had a skill set, he had plans, and he had people waiting for him. And in a lot of retellings, he becomes the historical equivalent of and guest. That's not fair. It's not accurate, and on this show, we don't let history's side characters get quietly shoved into the overhead compartment. Now, one detail that deserves more oxygen is just how close Earhart and Noonan were to completing the world flight. By the time they had reached Lae, New Guinea, they had already flown around 22,000 miles. They had crossed continents, oceans, continental borders, weather systems, and probably enough bureaucratic nonsense to make modern airport security look emotionally supportive. By this point, they only had 7,000 miles left, and that is what makes the disappearance even more agonizing. They weren't at the beginning, and they weren't testing the idea, they were in the home stretch. And the next stop on their list was Howland Island, which sounds charming until you realize it's basically a postage stamp in the middle of the ocean with ambition issues. Howland, at that time, was tiny, low, it was remote, it was barely even there. It's the kind of place that makes you wonder if maps should come with a confidence rating. Now, as we covered in the main episode, the Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed nearby to Howland to make it a little bit easier to find. Its crew was supposed to assist with radio communication and direction finding, and that was the plan, and it was simple, in the way that balancing a teacup on a moving train during a thunderstorm is simple. Now, the lay to Howland Leg was roughly 2,500 miles over open ocean. It would take somewhere around 18 hours, and they would be flying through the night, relying on calculations, radio signals, fuel estimates, weather conditions, and one tiny target sitting in the Pacific like a dare. Noonan's job was to get them there, and Earhart's job was to fly the plane. The plane itself, the Lockheed Electra 10E, had become part machine, part symbol, part media event. It was sleek, modern, expensive, and promoted as a kind of flying laboratory, which, depending on how generous we're feeling, was either a real experimental platform or a very shiny piece of public relations choreography. Which isn't a dig. It was the 1930s, aviation, celebrity, newspapers, science, nationalism, all of it was branded together. Earhart was not just flying, she was performing possibility in public. And that's powerful, but it's also exhausting. Because every record came with a headline, and every headline came with expectation. And every expectation came with the invisible pressure of proving again and again that a woman could belong in the sky without history asking to see her permission slip. And so now it is time for This Week in History, where we look at the calendar and remember every week is basically a junk drawer of human achievement, terrible decisions, and the occasional vampire novel. On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and laid out one of the most audacious goals in human history: land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was over. It wasn't just a science announcement, this was Cold War theater with a rocket fuel. The United States was behind the Soviet Union in the space race, and Yuri Gagarin had already orbited the Earth. The pressure was on, and Kennedy basically walked into Congress and said, "Okay, fine, let's do the moon." On May 26, 1897, Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in London. At the time, it was not immediately treated as the immortal, cape-flapping empire of spooky vibes it would eventually become. Stoker was known more for his work in theater management than as the guy who would accidentally give pulp culture one of its most persistent undead roommates. But then Dracula did what Dracula does. He lingered. Now, Dracula is everywhere. The book spread, the adaptations multiplied, and stage versions, film, Halloween costumes, cereal mascots even, bad accents and fake fangs. The whole bat-shaped buffet. The man now became the landlord of Gothic horror. On May 27, 1937, the Golden Gate Bridge opens to pedestrians. Before cars were allowed to cross, more than 200,000 people walked over the bridge, paying 25 cents for the privilege of strolling across what was, at the time, one of the great engineering marvels of the modern world. And that happened the same year that Earhart disappeared. And I love that contrast. Because in one part of the world, people were celebrating a bridge, a triumph of engineering, connection, and look what humans can build when they're not busy making everything worse. A few weeks later, Earhart and Noonan would be trying to fly across a different kind of distance, not bay to bay, but continent to continent. The 1930s were full of these bold modern projects: bridges, air routes, radio networks, the skyscrapers, or ocean crossings. Humanity was basically looking at geography and saying, that's a huge obstacle. It would be a shame if someone engineered around it. So that is this week's debrief. Amelia Earhart's story is often told as a disappearance, a mystery, or a legend. But when we slow it down, it becomes something richer. It becomes a story about a woman navigating fame, gender, aviation, ambition, and expectation. It becomes a story about Fred Noonan, a skilled navigator whose name deserves more than a parenthetical. It becomes a story about technology that almost worked, communication that didn't, and a tiny island in a very large ocean. And maybe that's why the story still grips us. Not because we know exactly what happened, but because we can feel how close they were. How close to the island, close to the end of the journey, close to becoming the triumphant photograph instead of the unsolved question. And history does that sometimes. It leaves us just with the radio static, and then asks us if we're willing to hear what's inside of it. But again, thank you for listening. I have been Dylan Gasway, and this has always been Naked History Debrief. Before we rip the fig leaf off the past, check the footnotes for turbulence, and remind you that if you're ever trying to find a 2-mile island in the Pacific with 1930s radio equipment, maybe bring a backup plan. And maybe a bigger island. And as always, we'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.